Hello, Old School Comics Review. Okay, today we want to look at New Teen Titans issue number 26 and 27. This was a well-received story called Runaways. It was written by Marv Wolfman, drawn by George Perez, with inks by Romeo Tangal. I think that's how you say his name. I'm not 100% sure. This is from 1982. This was back in the days where the New Teen Titans was basically DC Comics' best-selling comic book. Marvel Comics had the Uncanny X-Men, which was normally the best-selling comic book out there, and number two was New Teen Titans. And as far as DC was concerned, that's probably like their only comic that sold in comparable numbers. So that's one thing that was going on at the time. Another thing I think is really interesting is it's a very typical and in a lot of ways typical but very interesting look at the old, late Silver Age, early Bronze Age storytelling as far as like the pacing and how things are laid out and so on and so forth, and how the story unfolds and things like that. So I think it's a real interesting comic book to look at and compare that type of storytelling towards modern storytelling. Also, I actually remember this comic book when it originally came out. I was a very, very young person, and I remember reading it at the time thinking, like, wow, this comic is so gritty and so realistic. And when I was in my late teens, maybe 19 or so, I had been out of comics for a year or two, and kind of got back into it, and rereading the story is like, wow, you know what? This really isn't that realistic. And then once again, comparing it to what's going on, comparing that story to how comics are told now, plus just looking back at it after 20 plus years, in a lot of ways it's really, really hokey, but it is, like I said, pretty typical of the time that it was made. So, let's kind of jump into it. I just wanted to say that, it's an interesting thing to start with. If you're somebody that reads the modern Teen Titans, or they're not the Teen Titans comic, but the modern Titans comic, I think it would be an interesting place to go back to, because this is the team they keep trying to revive. Doesn't quite catch on the way that it did back then, but it's an interesting to look at. Also, if you're a fan of the cartoon show, the Teen Titans, where they use some of these characters, and retold one or two of the stories. Of course, the cartoon show is aimed at children, but like I said, this is what they would go back to. So anyway, let's just kind of jump into it. I'm just going to ramble on. I might give away key points of the story, but I'll try not to give up too much that you won't be able to read it and enjoy it for yourself. Okay, so basically the story opens with the Teen Titans coming back from last issue's big adventure in outer space. They're coming back to Earth. They come back to New York. They're winding down. There's some character bits and things like that. But interspersed in that, there are these little vignettes of young people leaving home. And this is a recurring motif that happens throughout this two-part story, where we see Grand Rapids, Minnesota. We see a young boy leaving home because his mom beats him. We go to the Bronx, New York. There's a young kid mouthing off to his parents saying, "You can't tell me what to do. I'm going to go out there in the streets and make my money, man. You got that?" And we cut to Skokie, Illinois, where a young girl is getting kicked out of her home because her dad disowned her because she became pregnant. And uh, basically, like I said, this is a motif that keeps going on, where you see young people in this environment, that environment, and what's going on with them. Now, cut to like a few weeks later, Dick Grayson is taking Starfire out on a date to a Broadway show, and Dick Grayson is still Robin at this point. And by coincidence, Adrian Chase is there. Adrian Chase is this hard-boiled district attorney. And what happens is a young boy runs up to him. He's shaking. He's sweating. He's going through all kinds of convulsions. He's got his little switchblade out there, and he tries to rob Adrian Chase. Of course, Adrian grabs him. He's like, "Calm down, kid." The boy breaks free, runs out in the traffic, and gets hit. And the scenes play like, oh, this is so sad. What was wrong with that boy? He was on drugs. Oh, it is so sad in the big city. Oh, it's sad everywhere. Next scene we cut to is Raven's at college. She's having lunch with some classmates or whatever, and she sees across the street there's a young girl. This young girl is, she's got gaudy makeup on. She's dressed kind of skanky, and it's of course it's the girl who was kicked out of her home for being pregnant, and it looks like she's walking the streets now. Oh, also, I should have mentioned the boy who got hit by the car is the boy who ran away from home because his mom beats him. Anyway, Raven walks across the street. She tries to help the girl, and she takes her to Vic Stone's apartment. Vic Stone is cyborg, and they're like, yeah, I know, I can tell you ran away. You probably hooked up with this dude that's got you walking the streets. You don't need that. I'm going to take you someplace where you can get to some help. So he takes her to like this kind of teen center, teen shelter type place. And he tells her, listen, I've been where you've been. I've ran away. I've been on the streets. There are places like this in every major city where you can get help. They'll feed you. They won't call the cops. They'll call your parents, but not before you're ready. They try to help you and so on and so forth. You get some nice information there. By coincidence, who's also there at the teen shelter? Hard-boiled district attorney Adrian Chase, because Adrian Chase has figured out that the young boy was a drug runner for the mob, and he wants to bring down the mob, and he gets he asks the Teen Titans for help. So, that's how the Teen Titans get involved in this aspect of the story. Meanwhile, there's a young man who seems to be following people around. We don't quite know who he is, but he's there outside the teen center. He's at Vic Stone's apartment. He's at the district attorney's office. He's at the docks where the mob guys are in their yacht drinking martinis with, girls in bikinis and so on and so forth. And that's basically how the story goes. You see what happens to young people and the youth who end up on the street. You get some information about how, you can help yourself, or how there are people out there that will help runaways. And of course you get the whole action part with, taking down the mob who are running drugs. And you also find out who this other young man is who's going around following people around. This story is very interesting, like I said, from a few different standpoints. One thing is, this is a two-part story. These days, this is easily a four-part story. And I'll say, depending on what editor you had it on and who's drawing it, it could even be a 5 or 6-part arc, This is back in a day where you really didn't have any of the so-called decompression going on, and there was the whole idea of every issue is somebody's first. A lot of times people are like, oh yeah, I like to read whatever comic. I like to read the JLA or JSA or the X-Men or Spider-Man or Batman or whatever. I haven't been following the new whatever. What's a good jumping on point? But back then the philosophy was, every issue is a jumping on point. Every issue is somebody's first issue. So, you really had compact storytelling going on. You had to tell your story, get it out of the way, go on to the next story. This story is Runaway story. Next story is Dr. Bad Guy. Next story is Throwaway Villain Man. Next story is Mr. Cosmic, whatever. I would say, or well, not I would say, but if you just look at the comic, George Perez's panel layouts and things like that, I would say probably averages at least 8 panels per page, except for the big action scenes and things like that. I literally have a Frank Cho superhero comic right here that was just done a couple of months ago, and the comm scenes in Frank Cho's comic, they're like 4 panels, and then he has his big splash pages, and then he has his double page spreads and things like that. And I understand it. I'm not putting it down. I understand that this comic book came out maybe 25 years ago, and comics are completely different now. They are made differently, they're paced differently, they're marketed differently, they're sold to a completely different audience. So I get that. I'm not knocking or anything like that. I'm just saying I think it's just a very interesting distinction to draw. Okay, I'm going to cut it here because I actually have a lot more to say. So join me for part 2. Thanks.